You know that After Effects is capable of working with elements in 3D space, but it may not be completely obvious to you how to get there. You enable 3D on a layer-by-layer basis. It's this switch here, or in the case of text, there's a special switch for per-character 3D. Once you enable 3D, a new option appears in the comp window that allows you to choose between Classic 3D and Ray-Traced 3D. For this lesson, I'm going to focus on Classic just to talk about the 3D environment. We're going to discuss the new Ray-Traced 3D features in a later lesson. Once a layer has been dimensionalized, it gets this new little widget that helps you to orient it or position it in 3D space. And speaking of 3D, the three dimensions are referred to as X for horizontal, Y for vertical, and Z for depth. It can help you to think of Z as towards or away from you, but that only applies if you don't move the camera. It's best to get accustomed to just thinking along three different axes, and the widget can help you do that at a glance. A few other things change in the UI once you turn on 3D. For one thing, your tools behave a little differently. Your rotation tool now acts more like a trackball if you click and drag on top of a layer, but you can still constrain its behavior by dragging on the edges or the corners. Your position tool still drags things relative to the screen unless you click and drag on the arrows in the widget, at which point you can constrain movement along the different axes. Things change in the timeline as well. Coordinate properties like position and anchor point have each grown an extra field, while the rotational property has basically exploded into three separate keyframeable rotational properties, plus a fourth three-dimensional orientation property. And if we look further down, you'll see that a veritable smorgasbord of new properties have appeared in a new materials category, including settings for drop shadows, the shininess and reflectivity of a surface, and many others. And you now have a reason to add new kinds of layers to the timeline, including cameras, which mimic real-world optics, including aperture, focus, and depth of field, and 4 different kinds of lights, including parallel, spot, point, and ambient variations. Some cameras and spotlights are a bit different by default in terms of how they behave in the comp. While they have positional coordinates like other layers, they also have a property called point of interest, which in the case of cameras is what the camera is looking at by default, and in the case of lights is what the light is pointed at by default. When animating these elements, be mindful of both properties or your result may not be what you'd expect. There are a few other caveats when working in After Effects 3D environment, enough that, since its introduction, it's been referred to as 2.5D. That's perhaps a little unfair, especially in light of recent developments, but it helps to know your limits just the same. For example, while 3D layers can interact with each other, casting shadows and intersecting, etc., 3D effects applied to layers, even effects like shatter or card wipe that use the comp's camera coordinates when rendering, cannot interact. Also, if a stack of 3D layers is interrupted with a 2D layer, the result is it acts as a sort of divider. That is, anything above the 2D layer will be rendered into a scene that appears above the 3D elements that are below the 2D layer. This can be very useful when you know it's there, and very confusing when you don't. And lastly, there's a camera tool set that allows you to quickly reposition a scene, either by panning, zooming, or orbiting around the scene. Be mindful of your position and point of interest when making these adjustments, especially when you're animating your camera. And don't forget that you can set your comp window to multiple views. This can be very useful when setting up complex 3D scenes.